On May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, a boy was born who was destined to become one of the most sinister symbols in the history of criminology. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer came into the world in a family where the bloodlines of different peoples crossed. His father, Herbert Lionel Dahmer, a descendant of Germans and Welsh, studied chemistry at Marquette University and later became a research chemist. His mother, Joyce Annette, née Flint, with Norwegian-Irish roots, worked as a teletype instructor. Jeffrey was their firstborn. On the surface, the family seemed quite prosperous. According to some recollections, in infancy and early childhood, Jeffrey was surrounded by the love of both parents. But behind the facade, darkness was already gathering. His mother, known for her hot temper and hypochondria, constantly demanded attention, felt sorry for herself, and often argued with her husband and neighbors. His father, absorbed in his studies, was hardly ever home. And when he returned, he was consumed by his wife, who was mired in depression and spending more and more time in bed. Once, she attempted suicide by taking Equinol. Little Jeffrey was left to his own devices. He later recalled that from an early age he felt uncertain about the stability of the family. The endless quarrels and tension between his parents became the daily backdrop of his life. Until the age of 4, Jeffrey was described as an energetic and cheerful child. But an operation to repair a double hernia, undergone shortly before his birthday, seemed to flip some internal switch. The boy became noticeably more withdrawn, retreating into himself. In elementary school, he was described as quiet and shy. One teacher noticed early signs of alienation. She attributed it to the absence of his father and his mother's illnesses, which only intensified when Joyce became pregnant with their second child. Jeffrey had almost no friends. Even then, he was learning to be alone. In October 1966, the family moved to Doylestown, Ohio. In December, their second son was born. 6-year-old Jeffrey was allowed to choose a name for his brother. He named him David. That same year, his father finally graduated and began working as an analytical chemist in nearby Akron. Life seemed to be getting better. But inside little Jeffrey, a void was already growing, a void that would later be filled with very different things. The name chosen for his brother would remain the only bright spot in this story of a childhood where the lights went out far too early. Jeffrey Dahmer's strangeness manifested early, perhaps even too early. At age 4, he watched his father retrieve animal bones from under the house. Little Jeffrey was fascinated by the sound they made. He called them his scritch-scratch sticks and began his own excavations, scouring the basement and surroundings for new bones, while also examining the bodies of small live animals, trying to understand where that mysterious internal framework was hidden. In May 1968, the Dahmers moved again to Bath Township, Summit County, Ohio. This was already the third address in 2 years and the 6th since his parents' wedding. The family seemed to be trying to run away from itself, but the shadow followed them. The new house stood in the middle of a forest, an acre and a half of trees, silence, and freedom. A few minutes' walk away, they discovered a small cabin, which became Jeffrey's personal refuge. He began bringing his collection there, large insects, skeletons of chipmunks, and squirrels. He preserved some remains in jars of formaldehyde, a little home museum of death. 2 years later, at dinner, Jeffrey asked his father what would happen if you put chicken bones in bleach. Lionel, a chemist by training, saw this as a sign of scientific curiosity and gladly showed his son how to safely bleach and preserve bones. He didn't know he was laying the foundation for a future ritual. Dahmer mastered the method quickly and eagerly. He began collecting the bodies of roadkill animals, dissecting them, and burying them near the cabin. Sometimes he would mount the skulls on homemade crosses, a little cemetery that no one knew about. He explained to a friend that he was just curious about how animals fit together, as if assembling a puzzle where every piece had to fall into place. In 1975, the experiments reached a new level. Dahmer decapitated a dog carcass, nailed the body to a tree, and impaled the skull on a stick in the woods behind the house. Then, as if as a joke, he brought a friend there, pretending they had accidentally stumbled upon the gruesome find. The friend, of course, suspected nothing. Who would have thought that a quiet 15-year-old boy was capable of such a thing? That same year, 1975, Joyce Dahmer, finally broken by depression and family troubles, began taking Equinol, laxatives, and sleeping pills daily. She sank deeper and deeper into a chemical sleep, further and further from reality, from her husband, from her sons. Her bed became an island she no longer intended to leave. And Jeffrey remained in the woods, with his bones, his jars of formaldehyde, and his questions about how death fits together with life. The questions grew more numerous, and the answers he found were not meant for anyone else's ears. From his very first year at Revere High School, Jeffrey Dahmer became an outcast. Classmates shunned the strange, quiet boy, and he found solace in a bottle. By the age of 14, he was drinking beer and hard liquor in broad daylight, hiding a flask under his jacket right at school. When a surprised classmate asked why he was sipping whiskey during morning history class, Dahmer shrugged and replied, "It's my medicine." Despite his withdrawn nature, teachers considered him polite and very intelligent, though his grades were average. He played tennis decently and performed in the school band for a while. Outwardly, he was an ordinary teenager, perhaps too quiet. But inside, a storm was already brewing. During his teenage years, Dahmer realized he was attracted to men. He never said a word to his parents. There was a brief relationship with another boy, innocent, without physical intimacy, but it only fueled what was already simmering within. Jeffrey began to fantasize. He imagined dominating a completely submissive partner, controlling him utterly. Gradually, these daydreams became intertwined with the dissection of dead animals. The line between the living and the dead began to blur. At 16, a specific fantasy emerged: to stalk an attractive jogger, knock him unconscious with a baseball bat, and then use the body for sexual purposes. Dahmer even hid in the bushes with a bat, waiting for a victim. But that day, the jogger never came. Later, Dahmer referred to this as his first attempt to attack a human, an attempt thwarted only by chance. Strangely, his classmates also knew Dahmer as the school clown. He would pull pranks that were called Dahmerisms. He might bleat like a goat, fake an epileptic seizure, or mimic cerebral palsy, right in a store or school hallway. Sometimes he did it for money. Onlookers would pay, and Jeffrey would use the proceeds to buy alcohol. In 1977, during a trip to Washington, D.C., he bet classmates he could arrange a private tour of the White House for them. Everyone just laughed. But Dahmer called the residence and somehow convinced high-ranking officials to give his class an impromptu tour, including a visit to the office of Vice President Walter Mondale himself. This episode showed that, when he wanted to, he could be charming and persuasive. But the desire arose rarely. By 1977, his grades had plummeted. His parents hired a tutor, with little success. They were also trying to save their marriage, seeing counselors, but the quarrels only grew more bitter. In September, Lionel learned of Joyce's brief affair. The decision to divorce was made. The sons were told it would be amicable, but the process quickly turned into a scandalous war. In early 1978, Lionel moved into a motel. In May, Dahmer graduated from high school. A few weeks before graduation, a teacher caught him in the parking lot. He was drinking several beers in quick succession. When threatened with being reported to the administration, Jeffrey replied that he had a lot of problems at home and that the school psychologist was aware. That same spring, Joyce, violating a court order and without notifying her ex-husband, packed her things and, along with younger son David, moved to relatives in Wisconsin. 18-year-old Jeffrey was left alone in the family home. The divorce was finalized on July 24, 1978. Joyce received custody of her younger son and alimony. The house was empty. For the first time in his life, Jeffrey was left entirely to his own devices, without supervision, without rules, without witnesses. What he would bring into that house no longer had anything to do with childhood. On June 18, 1978, just 3 weeks after graduating from high school, Jeffrey Dahmer crossed the line separating fantasy from reality. That day, he picked up a hitchhiker, 18-year-old Stephen Mark Hicks, who was heading to a rock concert at Chippewa Lake Park. Hicks agreed to stop by Dahmer's house in exchange for a promise of a couple of beers. A simple transaction that would be his last. When Dahmer saw Hicks on the roadside with his bare torso, desire flared in him instantly. But the conversation quickly shattered his illusions. Hicks talked only about girls. Dahmer realized there would be no reciprocation. No amount of flirting would help. For several hours, they drank beer, listened to music, chatted about nothing. Then Hicks began to get ready to leave. "I didn't want him to go," Dahmer would later say. He struck his guest from behind with a 10-pound barbell. Hicks was sitting on a chair, not expecting an attack. When the body went limp, Dahmer strangled him with the barbell's bar. Then he removed the clothes, spent a long time fondling the dead man's chest, and masturbated standing over the corpse. Several hours later, he dragged the body to the basement. The most terrifying part of the ritual was beginning. The next day, Dahmer dissected Hicks's body. He buried the remains in a shallow grave in the backyard, but a few weeks later, he dug them up again. He needed the bones. He dissolved the flesh in acid and flushed it down the toilet. He smashed the bones with a sledgehammer and scattered them in the woods behind the house. Hicks's necklace and the knife he used he threw off a bridge into the Cuyahoga River. No one missed Stephen Hicks immediately. Or at least, no one came to that house on the outskirts. Dahmer remained free. He still had 16 years and 16 lives ahead of him, but this moment, June 18, 1978, was the point of no return. After the first murder in 1978, Dahmer went into hiding for many years. But in 1987, he crossed the line again. The second victim was Stephen Twomey, a chance encounter in a bar, a trip to a hotel, and, according to Dahmer's version, waking up next to a dead body. Whether this is truth or a lie, we will never know. But he took the corpse home, dismembered it, destroyed the remains, leaving only bones and the skull as souvenirs. The first trophies joined his collection. From this point on, Dahmer began to act systematically. He regularly went hunting in Milwaukee's bars and clubs, choosing victims from those society wouldn't miss: the homeless, gay men, racial minorities. From 1987 to 1991, he committed 17 murders. His method became automatic: an introduction, an invitation home, sleeping pills and alcohol, strangulation, and then began what turned his apartment into a chamber of horrors. Over the years, Dahmer's proclivities worsened. Necrosadism and necrophilia became integral parts of the ritual. He had sex with corpses, made fetishes from body parts, experimented with creating compliant zombies. While victims were still alive, he would drill into their skulls and inject acid, trying to destroy their will. On September 25, 1988, Dahmer moved into an apartment on North 24th Street in Milwaukee. The very next day, he met a 13-year-old Laotian boy, a Nukon synthesum phone. Dahmer lured the child home, photographed him, fondled him, and then plied him with alcohol laced with sleeping pills. But the dose was insufficient. The boy woke up, escaped, and told his parents. Dahmer was arrested. Psychiatrists examined him and concluded alcoholism, lack of motivation for treatment. The court sentenced him to 1 year in a correctional facility with work release privileges and 5 years probation. 10 months later, he was released. In February 1989, while still under investigation for this case, Dahmer killed Anthony Sears. On May 14, 1990, Dahmer moved into apartment 213 at 924 North 25th Street. By the end of the year, he had killed 4 people. In the first months of 1991, another 3. The pace accelerated. By summer, he was killing about once a week. June 30th, July 5th, 19 for victims in 1 month. The last was 25-year-old Joseph Breithoft. On July 15th, Dahmer was fired from the chocolate factory for absenteeism. He had even more free time for hunting. His last victim managed to escape and call the police. When law enforcement entered apartment 213, they saw what defied comprehension: mummified remains, skulls on shelves, jars of formaldehyde containing floating body parts, and a large vat of acid in the corner. 17 human lives turned into a collection. Dahmer did not try to flee. He stood and waited for them to come for him. Perhaps he even felt relief. The hunt was finally over. On July 22, 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer was finally behind bars. The escaped victim led police to apartment 213, and what they saw shocked even the most hardened investigators. 17 murders over 13 years. Such was the price of the freedom Dahmer had enjoyed for too long. Dahmer did not clam up. He gave detailed accounts of all his victims, including the first murder of Stephen Hicks in 1978. On July 25th, he was charged with 4 murders, with bail set at $1 million. The list grew like a snowball. On August 6th, 8 more charges were added. Bail was raised to $5 million. On August 22nd, the count reached 15. One additional murder in Milwaukee could not be proven due to lack of evidence, and the trial for the Hicks case was postponed until proceedings in Ohio, the site of the crime. Court hearings began on January 22, 1992. The courtroom resembled a fortress. Metal detectors, dogs sniffing for explosives, bulletproof glass behind which Dahmer sat. Defense attorney Gerald Boyle, who had already represented him in the case involving the molestation of the Laotian boy, prepared for the biggest battle of his career. Out of the 100 seats in the courtroom, 23 were given to journalists, 34 to the families of the victims, and 43 to ordinary spectators. The whole world was watching what was happening in Milwaukee. The defense did not deny the facts. Dahmer had indeed committed all these murders. But, Boyle argued, he was mentally ill and therefore could not be held responsible for his actions. The attorney described the perversions and rituals in detail, trying to prove that a sane person was incapable of such things. Psychiatrists were divided. Everyone agreed that Dahmer suffered from necrophilia, but they disagreed on the main point. Did this warrant an insanity defense? Prosecutor McCann methodically dismantled this argument, proving that Dahmer was aware of the illegality of his actions, planned the murders in advance, and had excellent self-control, both in daily life and during his hunts. On February 15, 1992, the jury deliberated for 5 hours. The verdict was unanimous, saying, guilty on all 15 counts. The state of Wisconsin has no death penalty, so Dahmer received 15 life sentences, technically amounting to 957 years in prison. In his final statement, Dahmer did not ask for leniency. He said he deeply regretted his actions and asked for death. The judge replied that this was not within his power. The Milwaukee monster was sent to spend the rest of his days in prison, where he was destined to serve out his life. However, that remainder turned out to be short-lived. In November 1992, the house on North 25th Street where Dahmer committed his monstrous crimes was demolished. The city of Milwaukee seemed to be trying to erase from the face of the earth any reminder of the nightmare that had occurred within those walls. The lot remained undeveloped. As of 2026, it is an overgrown vacant lot. No one wants to build on bones. In 1993, Dahmer, along with his father, gave a television interview. He expressed regret, at least in words, for the suffering caused to the victims' families. The following year, Lionel Dahmer published a book, A Father's Story, attempting to understand how his son became a monster. In February 1993, Dahmer gave an interview to the Baltimore Sun. In it, he confessed that throughout the 1980s he had been haunted by obsessive thoughts of murder. And he added a phrase that speaks volumes about his self-awareness. If he were released, he would start killing again. No illusions about his own rehabilitation. In May 1994, Dahmer was diagnosed with suicidal ideation, perhaps a belated reaction to his sentence, perhaps an acknowledgement of inevitability. But death did not come by his own hand. On July 3, 1994, during a church service in the prison, a Cuban inmate attempted to slash Dahmer's throat with a blade attached to a toothbrush handle. The wounds were superficial. Dahmer survived, only to die a few months later. On November 28, 1994, Christopher Scarver, serving time for robbery and murder, beat Dahmer to death in the prison gymnasium. No one intervened. Perhaps no one wanted to. Dahmer's body lay in a freezer for nearly a year while bureaucratic issues were resolved. In September 1995, he was cremated. His father forbade the use of his son's brain for scientific research, perhaps the only act of mercy Lionel was capable of. The ashes were split in half. One part went to his birth mother, Joyce, the other to his father and stepmother. The family, which Dahmer had destroyed long before his first murders, continued to divide him even after death. Relatives of 11 victims filed a claim against Dahmer's estate and won. In 1996, attorney Thomas Jacobson announced plans to hold an auction, selling the refrigerator where body parts were stored, murder weapons, personal effects. Estimated proceeds, $1 million. The city was outraged. The civic group Milwaukee Civic Pride raised $407,225, bought the items before the auction, and burned them. Ordinary people donated money, just to ensure the nightmare didn't continue at auction. But in 2022, the story took an unexpected turn. Dahmer's personal belongings, glasses, an urn, and other items surfaced on the Cult Collectibles website. Families of the victims protested again, but the items had already been sold. The past does not let go, especially a past like this.